Let's talk about context. Now, The Logic of Failure by Deitrich Dorner, where Deitrich Dorner is addressing the broad subject of how to deal with complex problems, he has some very interesting comments on context and how they relate to formulating strategies for dealing with problems. There's quite a bit of detail in the book about this, and I'm not going to go into all the nuances of it. I just want to give you a couple key points. He gives an interesting example of how in one of his experiments, which he refers to as the Greenville experiment, where participants were in a simulation, participating in a simulation through a computer, where they were in charge of a town called Greenville, and they were basically the mayor of the town, and they had much more power than someone normally would in the real world over any kind of a community. He had one participant who made a decision about tourism that had a positive effect. It was a net positive. In the simulation, it generated revenue for the town, and it was a win, which is good. The problem is the participant didn't examine the context of it. I think Dorner doesn't phrase it this way, but the way that I would kind of package this is I think that participant felt like they cracked the code. And that could be because they were doing a simulation, but I think people approach a lot of things like this where they think there's like a code to crack, and once they crack the code and they know the right thing to do, they just have to apply that and it works all the time. And life is not like that. It's like that at times, but that's where context comes in. In this example, the participant didn't examine the context behind why that strategy worked and why it produced a good result. The long-term result was later in the simulation when things were not going well and in his simulated town was going bankrupt, he really tried to double down on tourism because he thought that tourism was the key to making the town successful. And the context had changed within the simulation, so he did not get the same results. Now, how do we apply this to daily life? There's a lot of levels, there's a lot of nuances to this, and I'm going to try and keep it short. However, if you're interested in more of a long-form discussion, there's a link in the description to my podcast. I'm actually reviewing this book right now, so I post new episodes every Friday. And obviously, I encourage you to read the book for yourself because it's an excellent book. I always encourage people to seek their own knowledge. Now, one of the ways that I have phrased this subject for a long time is whenever we're looking at life and situations, business, relationships, whatever, we need to try and figure out what to do at the time, like what is appropriate at the time. Because sometimes, because of context and what Dorner calls critical variables, you might have a strategy that's perfect for one situation that's terrible for another situation. On one level, this can be fairly nuanced, and sometimes it can be like super obvious. So for my purposes today, and we're going to come back to this subject as I build out my plans for this channel, but for my purposes today, there's two main kind of take-home points for why context is important for strategy. One is when we do something and it works, I think there's a tendency to say, like, we got it, we figured this out, blah, blah, blah. That's not always the case. We really need to examine why something worked and understand the context so that we can determine the best use for that strategy in the future. Because a lot of people, when they see success in an area, again, a lot of people tend to think that they cracked the code and that strategy is going to apply to all situations. And there are a lot of examples that we can find in history and business. It doesn't matter the subject. You can, if you study warfare, if you study just general history, you study business, relationship stuff, we can always find examples of one time when a strategy worked and another time when that strategy was a complete failure. And that brings me to my second point. The second place this is useful is sometimes we will try something and it won't work for whatever reason. It was a bad strategy. The strategy, in the context of this conversation, I would say the strategy doesn't fit the moment. It doesn't fit the context, so it doesn't work out. One of the reasons understanding that is important is because we might have another situation where that strategy is useful and it's the correct thing to do, but we can get gun shy because it didn't work out another time, and that's something we want to be cautious about. As we're dealing with complex problems, the more we can understand the context, the root cause, the underlying things, there's a lot of ways you can label it, the more we understand the context of what's going on and why things work and why things don't work, as we move forward, we will have a better chance of picking the correct strategy for either as that problem progresses or as we move on to the next problem. All right, so this was some quick thoughts for Mindset Monday on The Logic of Failure by Deitrich Dorner. Hopefully it was useful. Go read a book.